Hello, thank you everyone for coming today. We're going to have a little chat about data storytelling, which, as many of you will have seen, was a theme in the keynote this morning around some things that we've launched on Canva. But this is going to be more about the theory and the broader space. And to discuss this topic, I am joined by a very esteemed panel. We have Liz Grausom from an SVP at Statista. I'm going to get everyone to introduce themselves properly in a moment. We've got Lee Ralston, who's a Chief Growth Officer at the agency JKR. And we have Tracy Smith, the Head of Design and a Creative Fellow at Deloitte Digital. So before we jump into the themes, maybe you guys could just give us a quick introduction to yourselves, starting with you, Liz.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me here. This is a wonderful day, and Statista and Canva are now in a nice new partnership, which thank you for announcing this morning in the context of all the new technology and Sheets. So I come from a background of finance, so seeing Sheets incorporated into a creative platform is very important for my own identity. That Sheets should be everywhere because the spreadsheet is my love language. So that was great to see. But I spent my first 15 years on Wall Street and then as an investor relations officer. So my relationship with data started early in my career and meaningfully from a financial perspective, and how to communicate numbers to an audience, an investor audience largely. And then the last 10 years, I've been in go-to-market executive positions at various market research companies, including GLG and now Statista. So I am new to Statista, 3 months in, enjoying it greatly, and very excited about this new partnership.
Cool, and over to you, Lee.
Hi, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here in the beautiful sunshine of California. My name's Lee Ralston. I'm the Chief Growth Officer at JKR. Anyone who doesn't know who JKR are, or who didn't see the amazing talk with my esteemed colleague Lisa Smith earlier, we're a branding business. We are responsible for some of the biggest refreshes and rebrands of global icons in recent years. You may have seen the work we've recently done on the refresh of Walmart, Burger King, Mozilla, Budweiser, the list goes on. So we'll be talking today about, our core proposition is be distinctive everywhere. And we brought out a couple of reports that back that up and manifest in understanding the power of distinctive assets for brands, but also the power of distinctiveness for nation brands, in this instance, Britain.
And finally, over to you, Tracy.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tracy Smith, based out of New York, and I work for Deloitte Digital, which is a consultancy, but my background, sometimes people are like, Deloitte is creative? Well, we have an agency. My background is in advertising. Essentially, I was a creative director for many years, and moved over to a consultancy, very design focused, so we look at all different types of design, and this conversation, I think, is crucial for, what we're talking about today is really like, how can you bring creativity and design to data and the importance of that, and really remembering as creatives that we are valuable and there is so much value in what we bring to the table, because arguably, in my opinion, it's not just about the data that's presented, it's how we present it, right? And it's the way we present it and what that does, how that drives action.
Thank you, everyone, and so great to be joined by you all. So, my own background was actually as a journalist and author, and I co-founded a company that started out more like an agency doing data storytelling with Robin, who's sitting over there, and that led into a tool, Flourish, which has been used by a lot of the world's major companies to tell stories with data. So this is a topic we've been thinking about for a long time, and some of the themes that we have had in mind is that idea that a story basically is a narrative. It's something that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and that you have to be able to guide the audience through an arc of some sort to really tell a story. But obviously doing that with data graphics is a slightly specialist skill, or at least it has been until some of the things that we're launching today. But the broader themes are very easy to see in the research that we've been doing. We've recently commissioned some research that found that 74% of organizations now say that they've had a steep increase in data insights over the last 2 years, the importance and the reliance of data insights. And then 88% of people believe that data visualizations enhance the credibility of what they're saying, and that 83% feel more confident when they are presenting information if aided by data visualization. But in terms of how extreme you can go anything from a kind of simple chart, and maybe we could talk about some of the techniques to use those well, right through to the graphic I showed earlier on at the keynote, where we were showing a real-time playback of Canva usage. And this is like at the extreme end of what's possible. This is a big data set streamed into a visualization, but it's so compelling and so captivating. And I think a lot of what data storytelling is about is finding the right way visually to express the particular data that you have. But so to dive into that topic a little bit, so I mean, in today's world, and maybe this is one for you, Liz, we're surrounded by so much data, but it isn't always converted into meaningful action. And especially in the kind of marketing world, there's this permanent tug of war between the marketers and the data professionals around trying to get through that vast volume of data and to make sure that the insights that eventually get presented strike that balance between good storytelling and statistical rigor. Now, Statista, which is a giant repository of the world's data, you're kind of at the front line of this challenge, I guess. And with so much data available, it's almost possible to prove anything. So I guess the real skill lies in how we present it convincingly to others and which data we choose. So how do you advise your clients on how to strike that balance?
Sure. I think in our preparation, we talked a bit about kind of simplicity on the one side and making sure you're capturing your audience and capturing their attention in something that is easy for that audience to digest. On the other hand, you have accuracy on the other side to make sure that what you're presenting is actually factual, can be, based in fact, can be proven by your audience, so you're not caught red-handed with bad data. And so you have to balance those two when you're thinking about the presentation data to any audience. And simplicity, we were talking about this a little bit earlier, simplicity is really audience dependent, right? It could be a very simple chart for a consumer audience. It could be very complex data visualization for a CFO in the context of an internal presentation. And so you really have to make sure that simplicity is within the context and definition of the audience that you're trying to reach. For somebody who's not a creative, the beautiful presentation of data has never been easier because of tools like we saw on display today. So we've removed some of the challenge of presenting data beautifully and simply, which I think is really exciting. And I think AI is actually accelerating that very, very rapidly. My ability to build a presentation and present data today versus even 2 years ago is just very, very different. It's a nice world to live in, that I'm not spending as much time on internal presentations as I used to. On the flip side, accuracy has become more challenging, partially due to complexity of data. As you said, just the number of repositories of data that any enterprise has internally has escalated. I don't know how many SaaS applications your organizations use, but each one of them has data exhaust that needs to be stored somewhere, normalized, and then presented back into visualization tools, and that's a very complex process. Add on top of that external data, third-party data, and making sure that that is accurate is an increasing challenge for enterprises to manage, and your chief data officers do a great service to your organizations to help you with that, to be able to present back out accurate and credible data into the market, whether that's to your customers, whether that's for internal uses. And AI is actually providing more of a challenge for accuracy. So while it's helping us all in simplicity and the ability to present data in a credible fashion, it is actually challenging us more and more to make sure that the sources of data are accurate, defensible in market, and don't hurt your brand. Because I think as it's getting more and more difficult to capture attention, and it's getting harder and harder to maintain trust. And so that balance between simplicity and accuracy, I think, is changing a lot with modern tooling.
Yeah, I mean, they're really interesting themes which were very front of mind for us as we developed all the features we launched today. I mean, just to touch on a couple of those very briefly, when we thought about, well, can we just use AI just to serve up like factoids? And we realized that no, you can't actually, you can't yet. And you need sources like Statista to validate and give the credibility. Another one we found is when we worked on the Magic Insights feature in Canvas Sheets, where you can just say, tell me what's interesting about this data. You can't fully trust a large language model just to give you the answer. So what we actually trained the system to do was to not just return a fact, but to return a formula that could be validated by the sheet that expresses a fact. And so that always coming back to that sort of validation, whether that's through brand or through technology. But maybe to move on to you, Lee, I mean, you mentioned that you'd worked on a couple of reports, and I know you've been big users of Flourish as well as Canva. So do you want to talk a bit about, you know, the decisions, the kind of principles that guide your decisions when you're transforming these complex data sets into engaging visual stories that I know in your case are often designed to go well beyond a kind of like small client audience and actually reach a bigger audience?
Yeah, I suppose, you know, from our perspective, I spoke earlier about, you know, what we are known for as a business, which is a branding and creative business. And sometimes that pedigree maybe overshadows the thinking that goes behind it. So what you're seeing behind you now are those reports. And I guess we made the decision to go into sort of a more active role in thought leadership. And into doing that, we didn't want to add to the sea of sameness. There are a lot of tropes of reports that can, you know, be born out of the way that academia writes, you know, the thesis and the kind of, you know, the synopsis. And often that isn't necessarily the most engaging narrative arc. So we wanted to, in writing these reports, almost make the report as distinctive as the subject matter we were talking about. So in the two instances you're seeing here, the first one was a report in partnership with Ipsos, where they opened up their entire database for the first time ever to us to examine the power of distinctive brand assets, just exactly how distinctive are brand assets in the world. So that was 26,000 people, 5,000 brand assets, 500 different brands. And so we had to distill that to basically the headline clickbait data, which was, of all of those assets from global brands, only 15% of them are truly distinctive. So that was a really kind of, you know, clear sort of calling card for the report. And then within that report, you know, those, you know, the assets were defined as gold standard, truly distinctive, silver, moderately distinctive, bronze, barely recognizable. There are more scientific ways of describing them. For the purposes of today, that's roughly about right. So within the way that we brought the report to light, we had to demonstrate the scarcity of the gold assets and make sure that, you know, we represented the gold standard literally through the idea of scarcity. So to your question around principles, you know, how do we have a thought that governs the entire report? It's the idea that gold is scarce. How do you make sure that we represent it in that way throughout the data? And then on the second report, which was all about the distinctness of Britain, we went a bit wider. So it was very much around 3,000 consumers talking about the attributes of brand Britain, 1,000 business leaders talking about the power of Britain to sell, and then 50 years of legacy data around the attributes of Britain. And again, that required us to really think hard around what the role of data is, and really think of it as theatre and as moments within this narrative arc, less so about education. It's about almost entertainment and engagement, less so the imparting of data. That's how we approached it.
I mean, it's interesting just seeing the little reel playing from those reports. You really leaned into bringing those data points to life with animation and interaction. And did you find that helped with the engagement that you got with the reports?
Yeah. I mean, you know, the world wasn't waiting for a bit of thought leadership from us, so we had to punch through. And the whole idea was that, you know, if we can engage people in that data, then it will, you know, have an impact. And you can see from the stats and the coverage we got, it was incredible in terms of, you know, the amount of coverage. It made its way into MBA courses. It was covered by nearly all of the marketing press. we got on the government agenda with the Be Distinctive Britain report. So those things really only came about because we really thought deeply about A, the narrative, but B, the way that we were using data and the user friendliness of the data as well.
So maybe to move on to, back from the agency world into the corporate world a little bit more. So Tracy, you work for one of the world's leading consultancies, Deloitte, who we heard a bit from earlier during the keynote. And I guess in your world, kind of trust and reputation and credibility is really, really primary. But also you're speaking to a lot of decision makers with a very specific aim of making actionable change happen, because there's no point in having a consultancy in if they don't help you work out what to do and that doesn't get action. So what have you found when you're working with data and addressing that kind of audience works well to get that done?
Yeah, well, this touches on, essentially your question touches on the intersection of art and science, right? And something I'm very passionate about. So I'll answer it in two ways. And to speak to the science part, the data part, when we think about impact, we want to position data, or not even position, that's probably even the wrong word, focus the data on the audience. So knowing the audience that we're talking to, right? If you're asking about the C-suite specifically, so if we're talking to the C-suite, know what the business challenges are, right? So know what the business challenges are and speak to that. Have the data focus on that. To your point, Liz, simplicity is key. So speak to the audience and tailor the messaging and the data to, how can we help, right? And then don't just present data, but how can we think about being good strategic partners? And, essentially this is where real-time predictive analytics, real-time analytics come in, where it's presenting the data, but in a way that's like, if this, then what? How do we think about the future for the business? So there's the sort of science side. The art side is what I'm more passionate about, and arguably, I would say, like I mentioned earlier, it is arguably more important to bring the art and the storytelling to the data, because otherwise, if you don't do that, it's not going to drive action. And one thing we've been talking a lot about lately is, the reality is that we're not in the information business, right? We are in the attention business. And if that's true, which some people would say we actually have shorter attention spans, which is a challenge that we're dealing with, but what we're looking at is the fact that we have shorter consideration spans. So what does that mean for this? Well, when thinking about consideration, how do we actually create more sustainable, more longer consideration? Well, that's done through storytelling. And consideration, this is relevant because consideration is what drives action. So really leaning into the creativity and the storytelling is what drives action. And so how many creatives in the room? I'm assuming there's some creatives, designers. Right. We all know that there's so many different ways, even with Canva, there's so many different ways to think about storytelling, right? There's narrative arcs, there's interactive dynamic design, emotional beats, but no matter how we put it together, the value of the creative mind is really bringing the value of, okay, who's our audience? How do we position use the tools to position the creativity and then use that to drive action, emotionally connect. Side note, I have a filmmaking background, and what I was thinking about earlier is, when you think about documentaries, it's often based on a data point or truths in the world, right? But what's making the documentary engaging is the story, is the narrative arc. Otherwise, we'd be just listening to a bunch of data points. So, extremely important to be creative. You also asked how we measure, we have to look at business outcomes, think about, how it affects revenue growth, cost efficiencies, operational efficiencies, and all of that, and create frameworks around that to measure and track the growth. But at the end of the day, the data really needs strong storytelling. Look at the work we just saw from Lee here. it would just be a bunch of words if it weren't for your visual design. That was
Yeah,
gorgeous.
it's really interesting what you said about, really around consideration and attention. One of the things we thought about is who's our competitive context, who's our competitive set for this report.
Yeah.
It isn't other thought leadership, it's snackable content, it's YouTube seminars. You've got to really think about, can I compete with that?
Yeah.
And I think that thought you just said there around, really you're in a fight for consideration, not education. And I think that's, possibly where when data visualization, data storytelling is at its best, it actually engages and excites.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's something around the, obviously we spend a lot of our time at Canva trying to make products that people find easy to use, and what that really comes down to is user empathy and putting yourself in the shoes of the user. And in a way, the storytelling stuff is the same. I remember someone asking me what's the best tip for presenting better, and I think the single best tip for presenting better is really imagine that you're the audience. And it sounds so simple, but actually, often if you look at someone's presentation, you say, do you think they'll be interested in that bit? People actually self-edit and say, no, actually no, and then they take it out. But it takes just that little step of imagining you're the audience, and in a way that's what you're talking about there. I mean, Lee, you obviously work with a lot of clients in the agency space. That's a really primary audience for you. How do you bring the clients on the journey with you, and how do you kind of align that creativity with their measurable outcomes?
Yeah, it's interesting because you talked about the art and the science as well, and our client base are, commercial marketeers, but also creative people through in-house and other disciplines. And so really around, the way that we try and bring both of those parties on board and how we engage them is really thinking about which part of the narrative is most appealing. So for example, on the Be Distinctive Britain report, our office in London is full of inflatable pigeons and sausage rolls and David Bowie lightning bolts, because that's what we want to convey out the window of our office in the achingly cool Shoreditch. On the other side of it, the kind of commercial side of it, our Be Distinctive Everywhere report, we've had it played back to us in pitch briefs by clients. And that gives you a sense that we've got one foot in the door because they're playing our rational insight back to us. So the audience matters in terms of that. And then I guess, it's also around, what's the takeout? Do you want people to see the creativity? So when we're talking to, a fashion house about Britain or a pub chain about Britain, we want to be seen as cultural leaders. If we're talking to the government or, a destination brand for a nation, we need the credibility of the data. So that art and that science is always at pull and kind of push depending on who we're talking to.
And what about the data itself? I mean, we've been talking more about the presentation and the storytelling side, but a lot of what is required to even get to that point is having the right data sets, right? And I guess there's both proprietary data, there's public data sources. How do you see organizations bringing those together? What kind of organizations do that well, and what do they achieve by doing it?
Sure. So this is near and dear to Statista's mission as a database of a lot of publicly available statistics, but also a market insights platform and a consumer insights platform of proprietary data, which our clients use to make decisions in the context of their businesses. And increasingly, we're seeing our most sophisticated clients start to think about how to combine our data, so from an external perspective, into their own data environments. And AI is bringing that to life at a very rapidly accelerating pace to be able to bring multiple data sets together. The most important aspect of that is really benchmarking. I mean, again, I come from a financial analyst background, so a company's performance is only really understood well in the context of the market, the industry, at the product level for a product manager or product marketer to understand how a product is performing relative to competitors in market. It's very important for companies to increasingly have that external context, whether that's market share benchmarking, whether that's performance of a function. I run a sales organization, so I want to know increasingly how my sales organization is operating relative to past performance, so relative to my own internal data, but also relative to benchmark in industry. Are we performing well? Are we performing ahead? Where? Why? How do we benchmark our team? So I think we're going to see an increasing merger of data pipelines and a lot of emphasis in large organizations in particular. I think probably the largest and the smallest organizations are going to be the most nimble in this and figuring it out, of making sure that external benchmarks and internal performance are increasingly related to one another, and that context is brought, whether it's to the boardroom or to a frontline manager discussing performance with a sales professional, that it's related to external benchmarking data. And so we see a lot of demand in that respect for Statista services.
And how do you, I mean, just sort of curious about how it works. I mean, Statista, if anyone hasn't used it, has data on almost everything. I mean, you can go to Statista and type electric cars and you'll get 30 different data sets of electric car sales all over the world, different individual companies. How does that work? How do you make all that magic happen?
I am not the Wizard of Oz of Statista, so I don't know all the secrets. But the intention of the company was to have very broad coverage, right? A kind of a first stop of research. If you haven't landed on Statista's website at some point in your career, you haven't ever Googled what is the size of something or how many of this are here, because you will find us that way. But the breadth of coverage is a big part of the value proposition, that we're able to give insight across companies that cover many geographies, cover many markets, cover many consumer segments, B2B segments, et cetera. So it's a big part of the value prop that we make sure we maintain that breadth. It comes, with some compromise on depth in a variety of ways, but it's really to have a very broad value proposition to make sure customers can see across markets and have that visibility.
Cool. So I think we're almost out of time, but maybe just before we wrap up, is there anything from just maybe to go back to you, Tracy, like as someone who comes from that creative, kind of the art side of the divide, so to speak, what are are there any principles in the design world that you think are particularly relevant or kind of interesting for people communicating with data in the sorts of environments you do?
I think the principles change depending on who, going back to what we were talking about earlier, it's know your audience. There is simplicity. Simplicity is, of course, table stakes, but, if you're talking to a CFO, you want to present the data in a different way than if you're talking to a CMO potentially. So I do think it's being very thoughtful about who you're talking to, and then really being smart about how you're using the tools to express the data in creative ways. And yeah, that thoughtfulness, I think, is key, because attention, consideration is everything, but being thoughtful about how you present the data and design is, in my opinion, the most important part of it. How can we help you be successful? You, X person.
Well, that's a very fitting way to close. So I'd like to thank the panel. Let's hear it for the speakers here. I just wanted to flag up that we do have a design school tent focused on storytelling with data with Canva, and there's a Flourish tent too. So do grab the QR code and go and check it out. And with that, we'll call it a wrap.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you very much. Great show.
Thank you. Thanks, Duncan.